don't know how much time you've given to thinking about what a funny small world we live in and how amazing it is that people continue to bump into others and you just can't figure out how these worlds collide. I was sitting at my desk today and I had two text messages within about 5 minutes of each other. One of them was from a student here at Mid-America, and the other one was from my best friend in India, a national partner that we worked with. Both of them had met each other in a third place where they were working together at a missions conference, helping people learn how to be more effective in ministry. Today we're going to be talking about internationalization, that international missions is not about what Americans can do, but what about God's people can do wherever God is calling them to serve. And so missionaries being sent from everywhere to everywhere. It's one of the most exciting things happening in the world of missions today. Welcome to Introduction to Missions, Week 10, Session 3. We're continuing our study of applied missiology, and today we're going to be talking about the internationalization of missions. Now that might seem like a strange topic because, of course, missions is international. The whole point is going from one country to another to tell people about the gospel. But generally, when people think about missions, they think about people from the West going to Africa or Asia or Latin America. What we're talking about when we talk about internationalization is people going from everywhere to everywhere. So I want to start by just talking about some vision of why that would be what we want to do. Perhaps you remember the International Missions Conference in 1910 that we discussed before spring break. At that time, I mentioned that from my perspective, the best quote from the meeting was from Samuel Azariah, the co-founder of the First Indian Missionary Society. He said, "The exceeding riches of the glory of Christ can be fully realized not by the Englishman, the American, and the Continental alone, nor by the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Indians by themselves, but by all working together, worshiping together, and learning together the perfect image of our Lord Jesus Christ." He had the vision for internationalization back in 1910. Actually, Jesus had the vision for internationalization when he gave the Great Commission, because he said we were to go into all of the world and make disciples and baptize them, and then we were to teach them to do everything he commanded. Well, of course, one of the things he commanded was to go into all of the world. So everywhere that missionaries go is a place that missionaries are also supposed to be prepared and sent from. That's how internationalization works, going from everywhere to everywhere. So I just want to start by putting that seed in our mind that from the very beginning, as you enter into a mission field, you should be looking at how are these people going to go and take the gospel to the rest of the world. That's really not what happened historically. We've talked about with indigenization that not only did they not want these people to become pastors too soon, they kind of slowed down. Sometimes early missionaries slowed down, allowing nationals to take leadership of their own church. They created within the national church a sense that they were dependent on the Westerner. They were dependent on the missionary for funding, for direction, and that they were a mission field, so that missions conversations always revolved around who was going to come and help them. We need to be remembering that internationalization and the Great Commission calls us to help them know who are they going to go and serve as missionaries. Before we get any further in this conversation, I want to talk about some terms that you will hear in conversations about internationalization. Some used to be very popular, and some are becoming more popular. Probably within a couple of years, all of these words will be wrong and there will be new ways to talk about it. But just to give you an idea of where the conversation is today. Originally, people were talking about the non-Western world as the third world, because a geographic term like Western doesn't always make sense, because some of the quote-unquote Western nations are in the East. So during the time of the Soviet Union, the USSR, during the Cold War, people talked about the third world. And what that really meant was nations that weren't aligned with America and weren't aligned with the Soviet Union. They became the third world. Later on, people decided that that was a little bit insulting. They switched to talking about the underdeveloped world or the developing world, but again, that continued to be considered by many as an insult or maybe kind of a rude or judgy term. You're saying that we're not as good as you, so we're not as developed as you just because we don't see things the way you do. So that term was moved away from. People began talking about the two-thirds world, playing off of the original third world term. They were saying we're not just the third world, we're the two-thirds world because the majority of the world lives in these nations that we're trying to come up with a word to describe. More recently, people have referred to the global south, talking about Africa, talking about Latin America, but that doesn't always make sense. It's not geographically correct because Australia is in the south, but it's considered part of the west, even though it's in the southeast, if you look at the globe. So that word doesn't really work anymore. So for today, the acceptable term is the majority world. So when we talk about internationalization, or as you read about internationalization, most missiologists today will talk about how do we send missionaries from the majority world. What they mean is not America, Australia, or Europe. So just to have that term behind you as we begin then to look at some statistics and consider what is happening in terms of internationalization even today. In the year 2010, roughly 400,000 missionaries were serving around the globe internationally. There are lots of missionaries in every country doing home missions, but there are about 400,000 people who have left their home country and gone to another country to serve as a missionary, evangelist, disciple maker, church planter, maybe in theological education, some sort of mission service. As you can see from this bar graph, the largest country sending missionaries is the United States. 127,000 foreign missionaries have gone out of America to serve in other countries. But the number 2 country is Brazil with 34,000. So that might be a surprise to people that Brazil is the second largest mission sending nation in the world. 2 Asian countries are in the top 10, South Korea and India. South Korea sends about 20,000 missionaries. We're going to talk a little bit more about them in a little while. India sends about 10,000. Network leaders from Chinese house church movements established a goal of sending 20,000 missionaries from China by the year 2030, and they're making great progress towards that goal. Just one ministry, the Redeemed Christian Church of God in Lagos, Nigeria, has missionaries currently serving in over 100 countries. As a matter of fact, in the 20th century, the number of Christians in Africa grew from 10 million to 360 million. 1/4 of the Anglicans in the world live in Nigeria. And today there's a revitalization movement going on in what used to be Episcopal churches in America. They're becoming Anglican churches, and they're reporting back to Rwanda or to Uganda. Those countries are sending missionaries to America to reinstill biblical teaching in formerly liberal churches or starting new churches that are very conservative and biblically based. So we're already seeing God do this marvelous thing of raising up Christians from around the world and to go to all of the world with the gospel. I just want to give you a couple of examples to show you some different ways that this is being done. Every country on the globe is sending somebody somewhere, but just to give you some ideas of different models that are being used, I wanted to highlight a few examples. And the first one is the Korean church. Perhaps because of the influence of the Three Self-Indigenous movement that we were talking about last week, and the emphasis on the Korean church becoming self-propagating, the Korean church began sending missionaries outside of the Korean peninsula within the first generation of Protestant churches. So very quickly they began to understand that God was calling them to develop a missions focus. Most of that effort was focused on China. They had heard about China. A lot of the early missionaries in Korea came to Korea from China, and also, of course, Korea and China share a border. So that's part of why they were working in China. Today, Korea is one of the top 10 missionary countries. As we've seen, they have 20,000 missionaries serving around the world in the year 2010. In 1979, there were only 93 foreign missionaries from Korea. So the growth of the Korean mission force has brought blessings to the Korean church, challenged them in their giving, challenged them in their faith, challenged them to grow in prayer, and even to take some of the things that they've learned overseas and bring them back and strengthen and encourage the church there within Korea. But there have also been some difficulties, some learning opportunities that they've faced as they've grown. According to Timothy Park, formerly a Korean missionary serving in the Philippines and currently a professor of Asian missions at Fuller Seminary, he says the Korean culture is in essence monocultural. Thus, Korean missionaries in fields often try to impart their culture to the churches they serve. Also, missionaries have been inappropriately selected, trained, and deployed. And another serious problem is local church pastors who do not have proper knowledge and experience are often in a position of control over their missionaries and their ministry. So they're facing some growing pains as they develop their missions history. But the Western churches have been doing this for 250, 300 years. So it makes sense that they've already made some mistakes that other churches are just now beginning to make, and they're continuing to learn. But as more missionaries return to Korea with experience in the field and contacts with the global church, these issues are being dealt with and training is being improved. A friend of ours was the first Baptist missionary sent out of Korea and is serving as a professor at the same seminary where Dr. Mark Terry used to teach in Malaysia, and is working to improve cross-cultural competence of Korean missionaries serving in Southeast Asia. So they've started traditional mission agencies, traditional denominational mission boards. They're sending missionaries around the world, and they're seeing a remarkable response to the gospel. A second model is Comibam. Comibam is a made-up word pushing several Spanish words together. Congreso Misionera Iberoamericana. So taking a couple letters from each of those words, they came up with the word Comibam. It began with a congress attended by 3,000 Latin American leaders in October of 1987 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The focus of the congress was to acknowledge that after years of receiving missionary input as a mission field, God was now calling the Latin American church to become a mission sending base from which thousands of missionaries could be sent to the world's unengaged, unreached people groups. So that by the year 2006, by the time that this agency was 20 years old, Comibam had 9,400 missionaries serving in 140 countries, representing every region of their world. Their vision is Latin America taking the whole gospel to all ethnicities. So Comibam is a little bit different. It is not a denomination-based sending agency. It's a cooperative effort from different denominations, different agencies from different countries working together to promote Latin Americans going into all of the world. I've had the privilege of working with missionaries from both Korea and Comibam, and they are just incredible. Their faith, their willingness to sacrifice, their desire to learn, and their desire to impact the nations for the glory of God. A third model that we can consider would be the Philippines. The other two models that we've seen coming from the majority world were the Koreans developing traditional mission agencies, generally denominationally based, or in Latin America, regional partnerships between churches and agencies, but a third model developed within the Philippines. At any given time, an estimated 2.2 million Filipinos are working abroad. Many of them are in countries like Saudi Arabia, where missionaries do not have access. Nurses, nannies, construction workers, store employees who all have access to the peoples of the world who need to know Jesus. And so over the past decade or so, church leaders have realized that while they may not be able to fund and send traditional missionaries, they can train and commission overseas workers to bring the gospel wherever their jobs have carried them. So that's a third way that this kind of work is being done that's very exciting to me. I love watching that. I've had the opportunity to go and participate in some of the trainings before Filipinos take up jobs in other countries, and just to realize that the whole church is being called of God to serve Him in this way, and to see how they have been able to go into areas where traditional missionaries can't, share the gospel, make disciples, and plant churches is just phenomenal. The International Mission Board has been focusing on partnerships. One of my favorite parts of my job when I was still with the IMB during our last 7 years on the field was working with internationalization. Missionaries from around the world would meet periodically. We met in Peru one year, and Thailand a couple years later, and then a couple of years after that we met in Germany. Leaders and missionaries from all over the globe were gathering together to discuss how we could help each other as the global church ministering to the entire world. And every nation that was represented had something that they needed and had something that they could contribute, and we could find ways to work together to see God's kingdom advance in every corner of the globe. Some have suggested in conversations, both at those meetings and in other places, that the IMB should change their policy of only sending American citizens or people with green cards as missionaries so that they can support missionaries from around the world. And they thought, well, the best way the IMB could help promote internationalization is just to send missionaries from every country in the world. But the IMB leadership has intentionally opted to help develop indigenous mission-sending agencies around the globe, agencies that are self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating, leading the churches around the world to become stronger and accept their God-given responsibility to take part in funding and sharing within God's Great Commission call. It's amazing to see the different ways that that's been developed. While we were in India, there was a network of churches in the northeast part of the country, and they developed a strategy where every church member, whenever they would make a pot of rice, which was basically the staple food that they ate 2 or 3 times a day, if they would put 2 cups in the pot to cook for their family, they would put a cup or a half a cup in another pot that they would just gather up, and then once a week they would go to the market and they would sell the rice back, and all of the money that came from that rice would be then turned over to send missionaries out of that part of the country into other places in India where the gospel was not yet known, or into other countries. So that just helped develop their faith, that helped develop their strength, and helped them to really truly be an indigenous church that was fulfilling God's call on their lives. So this last slide, the last thing I want us to consider is some strategy. How do we prepare churches from day one to be a part of God's global plan? And my answer to that is we start by looking at the end from the very beginning. This sustainable engagement continuum was developed by my friend Joey and myself as we tried to explain to other missionaries and mission agencies how to see what they were doing as part of the bigger picture of the role of missions and missionaries as they enter into a culture. Rather than go through the entire process in detail, which I'd be glad to do with you over a cup of tea at some point, I just want to draw your attention to the end of the chart. So this chart begins on the far left with an unengaged, unreached people group. Eventually they will be engaged, and then there will be believers as evangelism takes place. A church will emerge. But you see 4, 5, and 6 are multiplying churches within Jerusalem and Judea. Step 5 or stage 5 is multiplying churches within their Samaria. And then finally multiplying churches to the ends of the earth. If we begin communicating this vision to the leaders in a church movement from the very beginning, they understand that they are playing a part in God's big drama of every nation, tribe, people, and language knowing and worshiping the Lord Jesus Christ. His promise in Revelation 7:9 that we know will be fulfilled. It's going to take all hands on deck. It can't be the Americans. It can't be the Latinos. It can't be the Africans. It's got to be the entire Church of God working together in harmony. So from the first day, we start talking about how do we enter an unengaged, unreached people group with the gospel. We need to have in mind, how do we stay with them? Not just until they're engaged, someone has a strategy, not just until the evangelistic message goes out and there's a believer, not just until there are some disciples gathered together in the first church, but until this church is starting churches and sending missionaries and fulfilling the Great Commission, which belongs to them just as much as it belongs to the First Baptist Church of any town in the southern United States. So that's just a brief introduction to the concept of internationalization. It's just amazing and exciting to see what God is doing, just a kind of a word of personal testimony. This has been on my heart from the beginning days of my call to missions. I actually earned a PhD because I wanted to go to Latin America and train Latinos to go and serve as missionaries. When I shared that vision, I was laughed at. That wasn't something that was ever going to happen. The Latinos were to receive missionaries, not send missionaries. And so now to be able to give you a lecture and talk about the tens of thousands of missionaries that God is calling out, in Brazil being the second largest mission sending nation in the world, it's pretty exciting. I love seeing God at work, and I love working together across cultures to see God's kingdom expand for the glory of Jesus Christ. Hope you're doing well. I hope you enjoy your weekend. Look forward to next week when we get together to continue talking about, for the last time, next week will be our last week focusing on applied missiology. Hope you're looking forward to it. I'll talk to you later. God bless. How is your church opening doors for people from other countries to come and work alongside of you to reach the multitudes who are lost in your neighborhood? How are you involved in working with national partners from around the world? Have you given much thought to being a part of the team that is the church rather than the team that is your country? It's a challenge for you to think about as you continue working your way through God's plan for your life. Praying for you to follow Him every step of that journey. God bless.